What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 12. Sleepers and studs.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to give you a sleeper pick and my favorite stud at each position.
And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made.
Oh, and good news, guys. Make sure to stay tuned to the very end of this video because we removed the box that was popping up and blocking the lineup. So now you can see a full lineup using these picks that we made in this video if you stay to the very end. Okay, guys, NFL Week 12. Let's take a look at the quarterback position. The stud on the slate at the quarterback position is Tom Brady from the Tampa Bay Bucks playing the Indianapolis Colts, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Tom Brady has averaged 25.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 1.6 rush attempts per game. He's projected at 24.4 fantasy points here in Week 12, and he's 7,600 DraftKings salary, 600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 52.5 points scored in this game, with the Bucks favored by 3. So you got a high-scoring game, a close, competitive game, and a fantastic matchup. So I like Tom Brady here versus the Indianapolis Colts. Okay, now if you're looking for a sleeper pick at the quarterback position, we don't have the ownership updated quite yet, so I'm just kind of guessing here on what quarterback is going to be low owned. But I think a good sleeper pick is going to be Jimmy Garoppolo from the San Francisco 49ers playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Jimmy Garoppolo has averaged 17.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3 rush attempts per game. He's projected at 17.1 fantasy points here in Week 12, and he's only 5,700 DraftKings salary, 800 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the 49ers favored by 3.5. Now, Jimmy Garoppolo, he's kind of struggled throughout the season, but his team has been dealing with a lot of injuries, and now one of their wide receivers, Brandon Ayuk, is playing pretty well. And they've got the Deebo Samuel, who's been playing fantastic, and George Kittle. And now Jimmy Garoppolo's got a great matchup here versus the Vikings in a relatively high-scoring game, in a close, competitive game. So this one could turn into a shootout. So I like Jimmy Garoppolo here versus the Minnesota Vikings.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $25 PayPal,
all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won.
And we'll send you $25 PayPal.
So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. So the studs on the slate, you got Jonathan Taylor, who's just been on absolute fire, but he's got a tough matchup versus the Tampa Bay Bucks, although that didn't stop him last week. But I just think he's got to run out of gas eventually. The guy got 32 rush attempts last week and 3 pass targets. So it's kind of hard to play a guy after he scores 56 fantasy points. A lot of times they have a letdown week. They might give this guy a rest a little bit just to try to avoid that injury that will come if you overplay them. So I'm looking at the stud on the slate as Christian McCaffrey from the Carolina Panthers playing the Miami Dolphins, who have the third worst defense overall. They're middle of the pack defending opposing running backs. Christian McCaffrey has averaged 20.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 14.8 rush attempts per game and 6.7 pass targets per game. Now, Christian McCaffrey is on the field for 86% of the snaps, touches the ball 51% of that time, and he's projected at 23.2 fantasy points here in week 12. He's $9,000 DraftKings salary, $700 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 42 points scored in this game, with the Panthers favored by 2. So, not a blowout here. Close, competitive game. Miami Dolphins should be able to keep the pressure on the Panthers to continue to score the ball. And Christian McCaffrey has scored 25 and 26 fantasy points in his last 2 games off of 10 and 13 rush attempts on top of 8 and 10 pass targets. So his volume has been increasing throughout the weeks since he got back from injury. Full strength now, no doubt. So I like Christian McCaffrey here versus the Miami Dolphins. Okay, let's take a look at the running backs, and I think the ownership, I don't think he's going to be a sleeper pick, but he is a good value play. So I like Melvin Gordon from the Denver Broncos playing the LA Chargers, who have the 12th worst defense overall, and they give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Melvin Gordon has averaged 11.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 2.8 pass targets per game. He's projected at 12.4 fantasy points here in week 12. He's $5,300 DraftKings salary, $1,000 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48 points scored in this game, with the Broncos trailing by 3. So I love this matchup for Melvin Gordon. The Chargers have not been able to stop running backs all season long, and Melvin Gordon has scored 10, 18, and 20 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 9, 21, and 10 rush attempts on top of 4, 3, and 3 pass targets. So pretty decent volume. He's low salary with a fantastic matchup. So I like Melvin Gordon here versus the LA Chargers. Now, if I were to venture into the deep sleeper pick realm, I think I'd go with a guy like Miles Sanders or David Johnson. Both of these guys are super low salary. Well, Miles Sanders is $5,100 DraftKings salary, and David Johnson is $4,500 DraftKings salary. Miles Sanders, he's in a pretty interesting spot, even though he hasn't been good all season long. But he did get 16 rush attempts last game and 1 pass target. Now, he only scored 8 fantasy points, but their other running back is doubtful for this game, and looks like their other running back is out. So Miles Sanders should be able to get the bulk of the rush attempts in this game, and he's got a great matchup. The New York Giants are the 6th worst defense overall, and they give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. They're the 8th worst defense overall, give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. So I think Miles Sanders, he's a high risk, high reward play. We know this guy has upside. He just hasn't shown it throughout the season, only averaging 8.9 fantasy points per game on the season. But he does have 20 plus fantasy point upside if he can get going. So this could be the game that he turns around, could get close to 20 touches in this one in a good matchup. So I like Miles Sanders as a sleeper pick here versus the New York Giants. Now the other guy, David Johnson from the Houston Texans, playing the New York Jets, who have the absolute worst defense overall. They give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Now, David Johnson, he hasn't played well all season long, but this again is a spot where he's coming off of a game where he got 13 rush attempts and 4 pass targets, only turned it into 6 fantasy points, but the matchup couldn't get any better. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Texans favored by 2.5. So David Johnson could get a good 15 to 18 touches in this game. If he gets the end zone at only $4,500 DraftKings salary and low ownership, he could turn out to be a pretty decent play. So I like David Johnson as a high-risk, high-reward play here versus the New York Jets.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL. NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. So one of the studs on the slate is Deebo Samuel from the San Francisco 49ers playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the 5th worst defense overall. They give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Deebo Samuel has averaged 22.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.8 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 83% of the snaps, touches the ball 20% of the time, and he's projected at 18.1 fantasy points here in week 12. He's $7,900 DraftKings salary and 100 more on FanDuel. So Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the 49ers favored by 3. And I like this pick because it's a fantastic matchup, and if you stack Deebo Samuel with Jimmy Garoppolo, you're going to save a lot of salary on Jimmy Garoppolo. I know you got to pay up for Deebo Samuel, but that stack kind of balances that salary out. So I like Deebo Samuel here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Okay, now if we're looking for a sleeper pick here at the wide receiver position, take a look at James Crowder from the New York Jets playing the Houston Texans, who have the 2nd worst defense overall. They give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Jamison Crowder has averaged 11.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 71% of the snaps. He's projected at 10.6 fantasy points here in week 12. He's $4,700 DraftKings salary and $1,200 more on FanDuel. So I like this pick because Jamison Crowder's getting pretty decent volume, consistent volume. He scored 16, 5, and 9 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 7, 6, and 7 pass targets. And he's got a great matchup here this week. So I like Jamison Crowder here versus the Houston Texans. Okay, let's take a look at the tight end position. So one of the tight end studs on the slate that I like this week is Dallas Goedert from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the New York Giants, who have the 8th worst defense overall. They're middle of the pack defending opposing tight ends. Dallas Goedert has averaged 9.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4.7 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 73% of the snaps, projected at 11.2 fantasy points here in week 12. He's $4,800 DraftKings salary and $1,100 more on FanDuel. So Dallas Goedert scored 11 fantasy points last game off of 8 pass targets. Pretty decent matchup here, and his salary is pretty reasonable, so I like Dallas Goedert here versus the New York Giants. Now, I skipped over George Kittle. He's actually probably the best stud on the slate. He's got a somewhat tough matchup as the Minnesota Vikings. They are pretty good versus opposing tight ends, but they don't have a good defense overall. And George Kittle has averaged 13.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.7 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 100% of the snaps, and he's projected at 14.9 fantasy points here in Week 12. He's 6,400 DraftKings salary, 300 more on FanDuel. So if you want to save a little bit of salary, I like the idea of stacking George Kittle with Jimmy Garoppolo, and that's a pretty reasonable salary stack. It's got pretty big upside. George Kittle has scored 13, 16, and 24 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 4, 7, and 8 pass targets. So I like George Kittle here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Okay, now if we're looking for a sleeper pick at the tight end position, I think 2 guys stand out to me, but I'm going to go with this super low salary sleeper pick. Take a look at Ryan Griffin from the New York Jets playing the Houston Texans, who have the 2nd worst defense overall. They give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Now, Ryan Griffin has only averaged 4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3.1 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 64% of the snaps, and he scored 7, 3, and 13 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 4, 2, and 7 pass targets. He's projected at 6.6 fantasy points here in Week 12. But what makes this guy an interesting pick is he's got a fantastic matchup, and he's only 2,600 DraftKings salary and 2,200 more on FanDuel. So if he's going to get between 4 and 7 pass targets at only 2,600 DraftKings salary with one of the best tight end matchups on the slate, and I think it makes him a pretty interesting low salary option here. So kind of a deep sleeper pick. So I like Ryan Griffin here versus the Houston Texans.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smickety smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NBA slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.